They shared the same roof through 2 winters. He proposed on the first warm day. The rifle was still warm when she walked in. I hadn't heard the door, I never did with her, even after all those months of listening for it. She moved the way water moves through a crack in rock, finding its way without sound. I had the Spencer laid out on the table, running the rod through the barrel for the second time that evening, not because it needed it, but because my hands needed something to do. The lamp was throwing yellow light across the plank floor, and outside the wind was doing what the November wind always did in that country, finding every gap in the logs and making itself known. She set a tin plate near my elbow without a word, venison and dried corn still steaming. I looked at it, then at her, then back at the barrel. "You don't have to feed me," I said. She sat down across the table, folded her hands in her lap and said, "I know." That was about the whole of our conversation that first night. But I sat there after she left, eating the venison, which was better than anything I'd made for myself in 3 weeks, and I looked at the empty chair across from me and thought, well, all right then. My name is Caleb Marsh. I was 44 years old that November, though some mornings I felt closer to 60. I had been working these territories since I was 20, scouting for the Army mostly, sometimes for survey parties, occasionally for men with money enough to hire someone who knew the Sioux country and bold enough to go into it. I knew the river bends, the sage draws, the ridgelines that looked like cover but weren't. I knew which passes held snow by October and which ones stayed open into December. I knew the band patterns, the seasonal camps, the signals that meant you were still welcome, and the ones that meant you had an hour to ride before that changed. What I didn't know, and wouldn't have claimed to, was anything much about living with another person. I had been a solitary man for a long time, not by intention exactly. It's more that solitude accumulates the way silt does in still water, quietly, steadily, until one day you look around and you can barely move. I'd had a wife years back. Her name was Alice. We were young and neither of us knew what we were doing, and the territory took her before we had a chance to find out. A fever, 3 days from sick to gone. I'd buried her in the spring of '63 and ridden north out of grief or anger or some combination of the two that I never fully sorted out, and I'd stayed north ever since. The post I was attached to that winter was a half-built thing along a creek bottom, 4 soldiers and a lieutenant who barely shaved, tasked with observing the movement of a band that had wintered in the valley the previous 2 years and might do so again. My job was to keep communication open, or as open as it could be, between the post and the band's headman. I spoke enough Lakota to be useful. Not fluent. Don't let anyone tell you I was fluent, but enough. Enough to be understood, and enough to understand back when someone wanted to be understood and not merely to speak. Her name was Winona. She was the widow of a man named Standing Elk, who had died the previous spring of a wound that should have healed and didn't. She had one brother in the band, a younger man called Little Stone, who was suspicious of me in the way that most men with good sense were suspicious of white scouts. She had no children, which in that world meant she had a particular kind of standing, not low, not dismissed, but unattached in a way that gave her unusual freedom of movement. She was maybe 35, maybe a little older. She had long hands and a way of looking at you that made you feel she had already decided something before you opened your mouth. The arrangement came about practically, the way most things did in that country. The post had one structure sound enough to winter in. The band was camped 2 miles up the creek. Winona came down on the 3rd day to trade dried meat for coffee and tobacco, and in the course of that trading, Lieutenant Graves, the barely shaving one, managed to offend her in a way I caught and he didn't. Not malicious, just ignorant. I smoothed it over, and she looked at me afterward with an expression I couldn't entirely read, and asked me in Lakota if I was the one who would be staying through winter. I said yes. She said she would come and cook, in exchange for the lamp oil and the flour. I said that seemed reasonable. And that was how it started. The first weeks were strange in the way that any new arrangement is strange. The strangeness of another person's rhythms in a small space. She arrived each morning before I was up, which irritated me for about 3 days until I got used to it. She built the fire the way her people did, careful and economical with the wood in a way I had not been, and she had coffee ready when I came in from checking the horses. She did not make conversation, and she did not seem to need it. She moved around the cabin with the efficiency of someone who has spent her life making the best of limited space, and she did not ask permission for anything or wait to be told where things were. If something was in her way, she moved it. If something was in the wrong place, she put it in the right one. She rearranged the 3 crates I used as shelves on the second week, and the result was actually better than before, which I declined to mention. What she made of me, I couldn't say. I was gone most days riding out to the band's camp, sitting with the headman, relaying whatever the lieutenant needed relayed, which was mostly not much. I was back by dark most evenings, sometimes later, once or twice not at all when the weather turned. On those nights she left food covered on the table and the fire banked, and I'd come into a warm room that smelled like wood smoke and sage and something else I couldn't name, and I'd sit for a while before I slept, just sitting with that warmth, surprised every time by how much it mattered. I want to be straight about something. This is not a story about a man overcome with feeling from the first moment. I was not. She was a serious woman, self-possessed in a way that put up no walls but offered nothing extra either. I respected that. I didn't sit up nights thinking about her. I thought about the work, which was always complicated, and about the cold, which was getting serious, and about whether the lieutenant was going to do something stupid before spring that I'd have to spend the summer apologizing for. Mostly, I thought about the work. But I noticed things about her the way you notice the details of country you're riding through. The way she braided her hair every morning with the same 3 movements, efficient and quick. The way she wore the middle finger of her left hand wrapped in sinew, an old injury of some kind, and how she never mentioned it and never favored it. The way she looked at the sky in the mornings before she went out, not a long look, just a glance, a reading of the light and the clouds and whatever they told her. She was always right about what the day was going to do. She caught me watching her one morning in late November, standing at the door with her shawl pulled close, reading the sky. She didn't look at me. She just said in Lakota, "Snow before dark." I said in Lakota, "I know." She made a sound, not quite a laugh, but in the neighborhood of one. You looked at the same sky and thought something different. I hadn't thought anything. I'd been watching her. I thought snow by midday, I said, which was a lie but plausible enough. Before dark, she said, and went inside. It snowed before dark. December buried us. I've wintered in hard country before and since, and that December sits in my memory as one of the serious ones, not the worst I've seen, but the kind that takes the measure of a man early and doesn't let up. The creek froze solid by the 10th. The horses needed extra feed and I had less than I wanted. 2 of the soldiers at the post got frostbite in the first week of cold, and the lieutenant sent for a relief rider who didn't come for 3 weeks. And in the meantime I packed the wounds in clean snow, which was all I knew to do, and they kept their toes. The cold did something to the inside of the cabin too. When it's that serious outside, what's indoors gets compressed. You're aware of the warmth you've made, the small zone of light against all that dark and cold, and everything inside it takes on a kind of weight. I was aware of her in a way I hadn't been in the milder weeks. The particular sound of her working, and all against hide, a knife through something, became the sound of the room. Her being absent changed the quality of the air. I don't know another way to put it. Winona came less often in the worst of it. She had obligations at the camp, family and community ones, and the walk was 2 miles each way in weather that could kill you if you stopped moving. When she did come, she stayed longer, sometimes past dark. Once she stayed the night. sleeping by the fire with her blanket around her and her back to me, and I lay on my bunk and listened to her breathing and the wind, and felt something I hadn't felt in so long I almost didn't recognize it. Not longing exactly, more like the awareness of another person being real, of her being a particular, unrepeatable person with her own weight in the world, and that weight being close to mine, and that being something worth paying attention to. She was up before me and gone before I could tell if she'd been there at all, except the fire was built up fresh, and there was a clean, swept quality to the floor that hadn't been there the night before. A pot of something on the iron, still warm. Little Stone came to the post once in December. He came alone, which meant something, and he sat with me and drank coffee and talked around the edges of whatever he'd come to say for a long time before he said it. The band's headmen were deciding whether to move farther south, away from the soldiers and the survey work and the whole accumulation of pressure from that direction. He wanted to know what I thought, which was his way of asking whether I knew what the army was planning. I told him the truth, which was that I didn't know, and that the lieutenant didn't know either, and that the people making the decisions were far away and likely not thinking about this particular creek in anything more than the most general terms. He was quiet with that for a while. Then he asked me, without quite asking directly, what my intentions were regarding his sister. I said I hadn't thought about it. He looked at me. "You should think about it," he said in Lakota. "Winter makes men think they feel things they don't feel." It was a fair warning. I told him so. "She is not easy," he said, not as a caution, more as a statement of fact about the terrain. "I can see that," I said. He drank the rest of his coffee. He looked out the small window at the flat white nothing of the frozen creek. "She is also not simple," he said. "There is a difference." He left. I thought about what he'd said for a long time. Easy and simple not being the same thing. I knew men who were easy to be around and entirely hollow. I knew men who were not easy and had more going on inside than you could get to in a year. And I knew Little Stone was telling me something he cared about, in the only way he was willing to tell it. I thought about his sister. I want to tell you about a day in late January. The cold had broken just enough for me to work outside without losing feeling in my hands, and I was splitting wood in the lee of the cabin when she came down the trail from the camp. I heard the snow crunch under her feet, and I looked up and she was carrying something, a folded piece of something, tucked under her arm. She walked past me into the cabin without speaking, which was normal, and I finished the wood and came in, and she was sitting at the table working a piece of elk hide. I sat down across from her and poured coffee from the pot she'd already set to heat, and I watched her hands for a while. The hide was soft from tanning, pale and smooth, and she was cutting it with a small knife in careful, deliberate arcs. "What's that for?" I asked in Lakota, because we drifted into using it more than English by then. "Your hands," she said, not looking up. I looked at my hands. The cold had been cracking the skin at my knuckles for weeks, split and slow to heal. I'd wrapped them in strips of wool and ignored them, which was my general approach to most things that weren't immediately dangerous. She finished cutting and set down the knife and picked up an awl. She began making the holes for the stitching with the same precise, unhurried movement she brought to everything. "You don't have to do that," I said. She looked up then. She had dark eyes that didn't blink when they looked at you, and she held a gaze longer than most people, long enough to make most people uncomfortable. I'd gotten used to it, or rather, I'd stopped minding it and started finding it clarifying, like a question put plainly. "I know," she said. Which was what she'd said the first night, about the food. I was quiet for a moment, then I said, "Why do you?" She considered the question the way she considered most things, not quickly, but not stalling either, just making sure the answer was right before she said it. "Because your hands are useful," she said, "to the work you do here, and you don't take care of them." It was a practical answer, a reasonable answer. I looked down at my coffee. "Is that all?" I asked. She went back to the all. "Not all," she said, and then she didn't say anything else. I sat with that for a long time. The gloves she made me fit exactly. I never told her how well they fit because I didn't have the right words for it in either language. The way a thing can fit so well it feels like it was already yours, like it was made with knowledge of you rather than just the measurements of you. I wore them through the rest of the winter without a crack or a split on my knuckles, and every time I pulled them on I thought about her sitting at that table with the all and not all. February was quieter. The worst of the cold had spent itself and the days were running a little longer, and the work at the camp had settled into a kind of rhythm. The band had decided to stay put through spring, which was a decision I'd had some part in facilitating, and the lieutenant was satisfied and therefore less likely to do something ill-considered. I had more time. More evenings at the table across from her, the lamp between us, her working on one thing or another, and me on my maps or my journal or nothing at all, just sitting. I learned things about her the way you learn a country gradually, through accumulation of detail, nothing announced. She had been born in the summer, far north of here, in country I'd traveled through but never settled. She had learned to ride before she could walk, or near enough. She had a story about a horse she'd owned when she was young that she told me once, in pieces across 2 evenings, and she laughed telling it, a real laugh, sudden and short, the only time I heard it for weeks, and I found myself manufacturing reasons to talk about horses afterward. Her husband, Standing Elk, she spoke of without grief and without coldness, matter-of-factly the way she spoke about weather. He had been a good man. He was gone. She did not treat that as a wound that needed tending. I found that remarkable. I'd spent years nursing a wound I'd gotten in the spring of '63, though I'd have said I wasn't nursing it, that I was past it, that Alice was past and buried and I'd made my peace. Watching Winona talk about Standing Elk, without the heaviness I always felt when I said Alice's name, made me wonder whether the peace I'd made was really peace, or just a very convincing impression of it. I told her about Alice one night, not planning to. It came out sideways the way things do. We were talking about the survey work coming in from the east and the changes it was going to bring, and she said something about how the land changes and does not ask you, and I said something about people being the same way, and then I was talking about Alice. The fever, the 3 days, the spring of '63. She listened. She did not say she was sorry. She said, "You still carry her." "I carried her a long time," I said. "I don't know how much is left." She nodded slowly. "That's not something you know until you try to put it down," she said. I looked at her. "And whether you can," she added. She went back to her work. I sat with that the rest of the night. I need to tell you what kind of man I was in that country, because it matters. I was good at what I did. Not bragging, I say it the way you'd say a horse is sound or a knife holds its edge. I knew the country better than most men I'd met, and I knew how to move in it and read it and survive it. I could find water where men died of thirst. I could negotiate with the headmen in a way that kept situations from boiling over, not always, but more than not. The army paid me because I was useful and reliable, and because I didn't make things worse, which sounds like a low bar but isn't when you're in the middle of a situation with a lot of moving parts and a lieutenant who barely shaves. What I was not good at was being seen. I mean that carefully. I was seen as a scout, a useful instrument. Men respected the skill the way they respected a good rifle, for what it did, not for what it was. I'd been working this kind of country for 20 years, and I could count on one hand the number of men who'd known my name and meant something by it. Women were fewer still. There'd been a woman in Bismarck, a widow named Clara, who I'd thought for a while might become something, but she wanted a man who was going to stay in one place, and I didn't know how to do that, and so she'd married a merchant, and that was that. There'd been others before Alice, brief and forgettable. What I hadn't had since Alice was the sense of being known, of someone looking at you and seeing not just what you could do but who you were while you were doing it. Winona looked at me like that. I noticed it gradually, which is the only way you notice a real thing. Not one moment where I thought, she sees me, but 100 small moments accumulating. The way she'd put the coffee in front of me without being asked, having noted exactly how I took it on the second day, and never forgetting. The way she'd answer a question I hadn't asked out loud because she'd been watching my face and knew where I'd landed. The way she'd once, when I came in from a day that had gone badly, a negotiation that hadn't held, a young man in the band who'd said some things that were going to create problems. She'd taken one look at me when I walked in and said nothing, and set a plate down and poured coffee and sat across from me in silence that wasn't empty. That was full of something I recognized but couldn't name. Presence, maybe. The presence of someone who knew the difference between a man who needed to talk and a man who needed to be quiet with someone who wasn't going to ask. She knew what I was. She'd seen how I moved in her world among her people. She'd watched me sit with the headman. She'd watched me manage the lieutenant. She'd watched me take a bad situation with a young soldier and a misunderstanding about a horse and work it through without anyone losing face. She'd watched me do the quiet, unrewarded work of holding things together. And she had her own opinion of it. Not once did she treat me as a decoration or a convenience. She argued with me in her quiet, unhurried way about the survey work, about what the spring would bring, about something I said once about the Sioux way of measuring time that she considered imprecise, and she was right. She said so. She didn't soften it. It was the not softening that got to me. Alice had been soft with me, gentle, and I'd loved her for it, and I'd spent 20 years trying to figure out if that softness had been knowing me or just being kind. Winona was kind, but she was not soft. When she told me I was wrong about something, she meant it. And when she sat with me in the evenings and talked about the country and the work and the things she remembered from her childhood, she was choosing to be there. Not obligated, not stranded, choosing. That mattered more than I knew how to say. The second winter started quiet and got hard fast. The first snow came 2 weeks earlier than the year before, which Winona had predicted and I had not. The band moved their winter camp another half-mile up the valley where there was better shelter in the cottonwood draw, and I moved the horses into the lean-to I'd spent September reinforcing. The lieutenant had been replaced that fall. Graves went back east, which was a relief to everyone. And the new man, a Captain Hodge, was more experienced, less prone to accidents, and almost entirely uninterested in anything beyond his own comfort, which made my job both easier and more pointless. The arrangement with Winona continued. It had never been formally renegotiated. She kept coming, I kept being there, and the terms shifted without being discussed. She was coming most days now rather than some days, and staying later. She had claimed a corner of the cabin's single shelf for things she brought, a small skin pouch of something she used as medicine, a piece of worked bone she sometimes used for smoothing hide, a length of sinew in careful coils. They sat there between my visits and I didn't move them. After a while they seemed like they'd always been there. We talked more that second winter. Not more words exactly. She wasn't a woman who talked for the sake of filling silence, and I never had been either, but the conversations went deeper. We talked about the country, the way two people talk about something they both know and care about differently, and those conversations had a friction to them that was interesting rather than irritating. She taught me things about the land I'd been moving through for years without fully seeing, reading the buffalo grass for how wet the spring had been, the way certain birds' movements in October told you how hard the winter would be. Things her grandmother had taught her, and her grandmother had known from her grandmother. Layers of knowledge about this particular place going back far enough that the idea of the surveyors coming through with their instruments, and their lines seemed not just wrong but confused, like someone measuring a living thing for a coffin that didn't fit. I found myself telling her things I hadn't told anyone, not confessions, just things I'd carried alone. A job I'd done badly, years back, that had cost a man something I couldn't repair. A decision I'd made in '67 that I still wondered about. not looking for absolution, just putting things down in front of someone who could look at them clearly and tell me what they saw. She was straight about it. She didn't tell me what I wanted to hear. She told me what she thought, and twice it stung, and both times she was right. I appreciated that more than comfort would have been. There was a night in December of that second winter that I think about still. The wind was bad, one of those nights when you can feel the cabin walls flexing in the gusts, and the lamp jumps with every draft. She'd stayed late because the walk back would have been dangerous, and we were both at the table and I was reading some survey notes I'd been sent, all precise distances and surveyor's jargon, and the abstract geometry of land being divided into sections. And she was doing something with sinew and small bones, a piece of decorative work she'd been at for days. It was past 9 when she looked up and said, not as an accusation, just as a statement of fact, "You don't believe you belong anywhere." I looked up from the survey notes. "I've never stayed anywhere long enough to find out," I said. "That's different," she said. She went back to the sinew, not belonging and not staying. I sat with that. "You think there's a difference?" "I know there is," she said. "Not staying is a choice. Not belonging is what you tell yourself about the choice." She said it quietly, the way she said things that were true, not making a point, not going for the wound, just putting the real thing on the table and letting it sit there. I looked down at the survey notes, all those lines dividing land that had no interest in being divided. "What do you think I'm telling myself?" I asked. She considered it. She held a small bone up to the lamp to check the hole she drilled in it. "That the moving is who you are," she said. "That if you stopped, something would be lost." "Maybe it would." "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe the moving is what you do when you don't believe you're worth stopping for." She put the bone down and began working the sinew through the hole, unhurried. The lamp stuttered in a gust and steadied. I didn't say anything for a long time. "That's a hard thing to say to a man," I said finally. "Yes," she said, "but you are not a man who needs things said softly." She was right about that too. I thought about it for the rest of that night and for several days afterward. Whether the moving was me or was instead the disguise I'd put on over the thing I actually was, so long ago I'd forgotten there was a distinction. I had no clean answer to it. But the fact that she'd said it plainly, without cruelty, in the same voice she used to tell me about snow, that stuck in me, not as a wound, as something I needed to look at. She'd seen it, she'd named it, and she hadn't turned away from what she saw. That was in December. By January, when she sat down with the elk hide and the awl and made me those gloves that fit, I think I had already known, somewhere I hadn't let myself look directly, what this was becoming. I just hadn't found the courage for it yet. I think the second winter was when it became a real thing. The first winter was the arrangement finding its shape. The second was when I knew what the shape was, and when I knew, for the first time in a very long time, that I might be worth stopping for after all. March came in raw and uncertain. The cold still had its hands in the country, but you could feel the grip loosening, the creek ice gone thin at the edges, the afternoon light running later, the geese starting to come through from the south in long, ragged lines that made you feel something you couldn't quite name, something like expectation, like the country was gathering itself for something. There was a morning in early March. This would have been close to 15 months since she'd first walked into the cabin, when I woke up early, before she arrived, and sat on the step outside with my coffee and just sat. The sky was coming up pale and cold in the east, and the snow on the far ridge was catching the first of the light, and the air smelled like mud and snowmelt, which is the smell of the plains giving winter back. I was thinking about what came next. The survey work was going to push through in spring. The army was going to move up another post, 40 miles east, and my assignment here was likely to end when it did. The band would move. Everything that had been held still by the winter was going to loosen and shift, and the pieces were going to end up somewhere different than where they'd started. I thought about Winona. I thought about 2 winters of mornings with coffee ready, and the fire built right, and the sound of her moving in the cabin with that particular efficiency that I had learned so completely I could reconstruct it in its absence. I thought about the gloves on my hands, and not all in the way she'd looked at me across the lamp when I talked about Alice, steady and attentive, and without pity. I thought about little Stone saying she is not simple. I thought about the second winter and things put down and looked at clearly. I thought about what I would do if this ended and she just went back to camp and I rode out and that was it. I sat with that thought for a while. It had a weight I hadn't expected. She came down the trail in the middle of that thought. I heard her on the snow and looked up and she was already looking at me, which meant she'd been watching from a distance and had decided to come on anyway, not turn back. She stopped a few feet from the step. I didn't say anything right away. I was still sitting with the weight of the thought. She stood there with her shawl around her and looked at me. "You're outside," she said. "Warmer than yesterday," I said. She looked at the sky. "Not warm." "Warmer." She considered this. She sat down on the far end of the step with maybe 3 feet between us, which was the way she did things, present but not crowding. We sat for a while. The light was coming up properly now, the ridge going from pale to orange. "The survey will come through in April," I said. "I know. The post here is likely done in May, maybe June at the latest." "I know." I turned to look at her. She was still looking at the ridge. "What will you do?" I asked. "Go with the band," she said, simply, as if it were obvious because it was obvious. "Where will the band go?" "North first, then wherever." I looked back at the ridge. I could feel the cold of the step through my trousers. "I don't want to go wherever," I said, "and I don't want to go north if you're not the reason." She was quiet. I could feel her being quiet the way you can feel whether moving in, a particular quality of stillness. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want to ask you something," I said. "But I want to get it right, and I'm not sure I have the words in either language." She turned and looked at me then. Direct, unhurried, that long gaze that didn't blink. "Try," she said. I turned on the step and faced her. I had thought about this, not a speech. I didn't have a speech. I wasn't capable of a speech. But I had thought about what was true and what I wanted to say and whether I had any right to say it. I had the gloves on as it happened. I'd pulled them on when I came out. "You've lived in the same house as me for better than a year," I said. "You know what I am. Not what I can do, what I am. The parts that aren't the work. The mornings I don't talk and the nights I sit and don't sleep and the way I go quiet when things go badly. You've seen all of it. You haven't left. You haven't looked at me like I'm less than I was." I stopped. She was still looking at me. "Most people in my life have looked at me like a tool," I said. "Useful, reliable, not real. You never did that. From the first week you treated me like a man who had an interior, like there was something worth knowing in here besides the skill." I put my hand over my chest, which felt excessive, but it was the truest gesture I had. "I'm 45 years old and I've been alone for 20 years and I know what that does to a man," I said. "It makes him think maybe that's all there is for him. Maybe that's who he is. The tool, the scout, the useful man with nowhere to belong." I stopped again. "You made me think different," I said. "Not by anything you said. By how you treated me. And I want to know if you'd be willing to stay. Not here, I don't know where I'm going to be after June, but with me, wherever that is." She didn't say anything right away. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she looked down at my hands, the gloves, and she reached out and touched the back of one. Just the backs of her fingers against the leather. A light thing. A deliberate thing. "I made those so you would take care of yourself," she said. "I know. You didn't take care of yourself before." "I know. You would have to learn." "I know that too." She took her hand back. She looked at the ridge again, which was fully gold now, the light coming on strong. "The band will say things," she said. "Probably. Little Stone will say things. Probably. He's been preparing since December." The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, closer to a decision. "You want a real answer," she said, "not a question." "I want your real answer, whatever it is." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in Lakota, she chose Lakota, which meant she was saying exactly what she meant and not approximately, "I have been waiting for you to find your courage on this matter since November." I looked at her. "I stayed," she said, "through 2 winters. I know what I was doing." I looked at her hands in her lap. I looked at the ridge. I felt something in my chest that I hadn't felt in a very long time, something so large and uncomplicated it almost had no shape. "November of last year or November before," I said. "Before," she said. A year longer than I'd been paying attention. She'd seen it before I'd seen it. "That's a long time to wait," I said. "You needed time," she said. "Some men do." She told Little Stone that evening. I wasn't there for the conversation, which was correct. It wasn't mine to be part of. She came back in the dark and I had food on the table and the fire built up, which was the first time I'd done that without being prompted, and she sat down and looked at the table and then at me and said, "He will come and talk to you." "I know. He will be difficult. I know. You should not try to convince him. You should listen." "All right." She picked up her fork. She looked at the food. "You cooked this yourself," she said. "I did. It's not terrible. Thank you. The fire is good. I've been watching how you do it." She was quiet. She ate. After a while she said, "I will teach you the rest of it if you want to know." "I want to know," I said. She put her fork down and looked at me for a moment, that clear, direct look. "Then we will have something to do," she said, "while we figure out the rest." Little Stone came 3 days later, which meant he'd spent 3 days deciding what to say and how to say it. He came in the afternoon and sat at the table and refused coffee, and looked at me with the expression of a man who has made a decision and is making sure you understand the weight of it. He said he had questions. I said I expected that. He asked me where I would go after June. I told him honestly I didn't know, possibly Kansas, possibly farther south, possibly I'd work out some arrangement with one of the outfits coming in from the east. He asked me what I knew about living the way his sister lived. I said not enough, and that I was willing to learn and that she had agreed to teach me. He asked me what I offered her. I thought about that one carefully. "I'm not rich," I said. "I've got a horse and my gear and whatever I get paid, I know the country. I've got my health so far, knock on something. What I can offer her is that I see her, not what she does for me, her, and I'll be there whatever that costs." He looked at me for a long time. "She sees you too," he said. "I know, that's why I asked." He was quiet. He looked out the window. "She is strong," he said. "She has always been strong, but she has not been seen the way she sees. It has been only one direction for a long time." He stopped. "It is a hard thing," he said, "to see everything and be seen by nothing." I didn't say anything. It was true. I knew what that was. I'd lived it for 20 years, being the instrument in the corner, the useful and invisible man. I'd been seen for my skill and not for the man behind the skill, and I knew what that did over time, how it made you doubt there was a man behind the skill worth seeing at all. He looked back at me. The expression had changed. It wasn't warm exactly, but the edge was gone. "Take care of her," he said. "I intend to. Not as something fragile. No, not like that." He nodded once. He stood up. He didn't shake my hand, that wasn't his way, but he looked at me directly, which I understood to mean something, and he went out. I sat in the cabin after he left for a while, looking at the fire. I thought about what he'd said, to see everything and be seen by nothing. That was what she'd been living with. And I'd come into that cabin and she'd taken one look at me across that first awkward exchange about trading an offense and lamp oil, and she'd made a decision. Not a simple one, not a hasty one, a clear-eyed one. She'd watched me all through that first winter, and she'd known what I was before I knew what she was, and she'd stayed and she'd made me gloves that fit, and she'd waited and she'd known. Some people see things. Some people don't. She was the kind who does. The first warm day came near the end of April. It came the way warm days come after a long winter, sudden and unreasonable, like the sky had decided to stop making a point. The air was soft in a way that seemed borrowed from somewhere else, and the creek was running clean and loud, and there were birds in the cottonwoods that hadn't been there the day before. Winona and I had ridden out to check on one of the supply caches up the draw, and we were making our way back along the creek in no particular hurry when she pulled up to look at something on the far bank, some bird she'd spotted in the willows, and I stopped beside her. I looked at her instead of the bird. She had her hair braided back in the way she always did, and she was squinting a little into the light, and her face was that particular face she made when she was paying attention to something, alert, settled, entirely herself. The light was hitting her sideways, and the creek was running between us and the willows, and everything smelled like mud and water and new grass. She looked over and saw me watching her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," I said. She went back to the bird. Then she said, "You have something to say." "I already said it in March." "You said it on the step," she said, in the cold, in a halting way. I was halting. "I know." She looked at me. "Say it properly," she said, "now when it's warm." She was serious, I could see that. She wanted the real thing, said plainly in the light. I straightened up in the saddle. I thought about what she'd said in March. "I have been waiting for you to find your courage. Some men do." "Winona," I said. "Yes." "You've seen the whole of me. 2 winters. You know what you're getting. It's not much compared to what you deserve, but I'm asking you, I want you to marry me, if you'll have me." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the creek. She looked at the willows. She looked back at me. "I already told you yes," she said, "in March." "I know, I wanted to ask it right." "It is better in the warm," she allowed. She reached over from her horse, across the space between us, and put her hand on my arm. She left it there. The warmth of her hand through my sleeve. It was the realest thing I'd felt in years. Not dramatic, just real. Solid and deliberate, her hand on my arm and her looking at me, and the creek going past, and the whole country opening up into spring around us like it had been waiting to do this the whole time winter had it held down. "You are a careful man," she said, "about most things." "Most things," I said. "You were not careful about this." "No." She squeezed my arm once and took her hand back. "Good," she said. We were married in June, a little before the post closed down. I didn't have a church and there was no minister within 4 days' ride, so we did it 2 ways, which seemed right. We stood at the creek in the morning with Little Stone and 2 of the elder women from the band, and Winona's people recognized it the way her people recognized such things, through the witness of kin, through words spoken in Lakota, through small things I won't describe because they were theirs and not mine to tell. In the afternoon, I wrote it down in my journal, the date and both our names, and I signed it, and she put her mark on it beside mine, and I told her that in the white world that was as legal as it got out here without a minister, and she said the white world would have to manage. We rode south in early July. The plan, such as it was, because I've never been much for plans past about 6 weeks, was to work the survey outfits coming up from the south, which paid better than the army and asked less of my patience. Little Stone rode with us as far as the creek divide, and when he turned back he looked at me again the way he'd looked at me in the cabin, level, measuring, and then he nodded, and that was that. I'll tell you what that first year of riding together was like, because people don't usually tell that part. It was not easy. I don't want to make it sound like love settled everything, because it doesn't. Two people with their own ways of doing things and their own silences and their own histories don't just fall into step. We had arguments that first year, real ones, the kind that come from two people being honest enough with each other that the friction is unavoidable. About money, and about how long to stay in a place, and once about something I'd said in front of a group of survey men that she'd found insulting, and I hadn't understood why until she explained it to me at some length. And then I understood, and it took me 3 days to find the right way to say I'd been wrong. She didn't make it easy when I was wrong. She didn't punish it either. She let me find my way to the apology, and then she accepted it without ceremony, and we moved on. That was how she did it. No storage of grievances, no ledger, just the thing itself, dealt with and then done. I came to understand that this was a kind of respect, treating the argument as a real thing, worth having, rather than something to be smoothed over. She took me seriously enough to argue with me seriously. After 20 years of being the useful and invisible man, that a woman who argued with me like my opinion mattered and my wrongness could be corrected, that was something. I learned to ride with her rather than alongside her, different thing. And somewhere in that first year I stopped moving the way I'd moved for 20 years, always with one eye on the next posting, the next country, the next useful place to be. I started stopping, looking at a place and wondering if it was somewhere to stay rather than somewhere to pass through. That was her doing, though she never said a word about it. She just was there, and being there she made there mean something. I have been trying to think of how to end this, how to say the rest of it in a way that doesn't oversimplify it or dress it up. The truth is there is no single ending to a thing like this. It keeps ending and beginning again the whole time you're living it. There's the ending where she says yes in March. There's the ending at the creek when she puts her hand on my arm and the whole country smells like mud and new grass. There's the ending in June with her mark in my journal beside mine, and the lieutenant watching from a respectful distance, puzzled and not asking. There's the ending the first morning of the ride south, when I looked back once at the creek bottom and the cabin and all that country, and then I looked forward, and she was already looking forward, and I understood that she'd never looked back at all, not because there was nothing behind her worth looking at, but because what was ahead was where she was going, and that was that. And then there are the smaller endings, the ones that accumulate over years. The first time we laughed at the same thing at the same moment, unexpectedly, out in the open air somewhere in Kansas, and I thought, that is a thing I didn't know I was missing. The first time she was sick, nothing serious, a fever that lasted 4 days, and I understood what it was to be the person in the room, the one who sits and waits and tends, and how different that was from being the one tended. The first time we disagreed badly enough that neither of us said anything for a full day, and then the next morning she made coffee and put it in front of me, and I said thank you, and she said something in Lakota that I didn't quite catch, but the tone of it was enough, and that was the end of that. All of those are endings. All of them are also beginnings. 16 years is not a long time when I say it out loud. It is a very long time when I think about who I was at the start of it. I'm 61 now, and we have been married 16 years, and the things I want to tell you about those years are too many for one sitting and wouldn't fit anyway. Life in the years after a moment like that is not a continuation of the same feeling. It's something harder and better than that. It's the work of actually becoming the thing you said you'd be to each other. We've had good years and a few that weren't. We've buried a horse we both loved and a dog she'd raised from a pup and an old friend of mine from the army days who came through one summer and stayed 2 weeks and made us both laugh in ways we hadn't expected. We've fought about real things and settled them and come out on the other side still knowing who the other person was. What I'll say is this: she was right that I didn't know how to take care of myself. She taught me, patiently in the way she did everything without softening it enough to make it dishonest, And she let me take care of her in return, which is the harder thing when you are the stronger person, and she knew that and she did it anyway. She let me be needed. That was the gift, and I understood what it cost her to give it. What I will say is that I know now what I didn't know on that step in March, that what she gave me when she stayed those 2 winters was not company. It was not convenience. It was recognition. She looked at me and she saw a man worth looking at, not a scout, not an instrument, not the useful thing in the corner. A man, with an interior like she'd always known was there. And knowing that being known like that changes a man, it changed me, not into something soft, into something more solid, like a thing finally put right in the place where it was always supposed to sit. I am sitting in a warm room, which we built together in the spring of '71, not by choice. I wasn't going to make her live in logs forever, but she put her hand in every part of it, and that house is as much hers as anything I've built in my life. She is somewhere out back with the horses. I can hear her talking to the gray one, which is getting old, which she refuses to discuss. My hands don't crack anymore in cold weather, haven't in years. The gloves she made me in January of '65 wore out 4 winters later, and I still have them in a box. I kept them because they were the first thing she made me, because they fit, because a thing made with knowledge of you, real knowledge, not measurements, because that's not a thing you throw away. You keep it. You hold on to it and you don't let go, and you remember what it is to be known by someone who chose to know you, and you try to deserve it every day, and that is enough. That is more than enough.